But I'm particularly happy to welcome tonight's panelists and to get tonight's event started called All the Rage. That's really about rage in internet spaces, and especially the ways in which right rage has taken shape in and through various kinds of social media. Our moderator for tonight's discussion will have more to say about that in a moment, but I do want to give you a sense of how tonight's program will work, because it will be a little bit different than some of the events that we've done in the past. So first, I want to make sure that you are aware that, as you know, your speakers are all muted, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to participate actively in tonight's event and engage with us as best you can. So the chat window is available. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, if you're unfamiliar, and click on the chat icon, you'll find access to it. We'll be posting some information there throughout the course of the talk about upcoming OCH events, as well as links to our website. And we also encourage you to ask questions and make comments throughout this evening's event in the chat window. The speakers will generally have it closed, though the session moderator will have it open, and we'll be using that to help guide some of the questions this evening. So please don't save all your questions for the Q&A session at the end of the event. We want you to be engaged with us as early as you can and to share your thoughts and ideas from the very start of the event. I do want to let you know that that your name will be associated with everything that you post, and we'll see that here, and we will be saving the chat log for our own internal use as well. And just to get you used to using that, I would actually like to take a moment. This is something we've started doing because we found it's actually a really nice way to start programs like this. We'd like to ask you to just take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat, maybe just say hello. If you're, especially we'd love to hear where you're from. Are you joining us from Tulsa or from elsewhere in the country? So please just take a moment to say hello and to create the sense of community in this virtual environment that it's so difficult, that we'd like to be able to cultivate if we were able to hold this event on campus. So please take a moment, if you would, and introduce yourself, however briefly, in the chat, because we're very glad to have you here and delighted to welcome you to the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities and to create this opportunity for conversation and exchange. One of the distinctive things that we've actually found about having to shift to this online environment is that we're able to bring together people from all parts of the country that we weren't able to do so before, and this has been a really exciting part of this change for us, and we're very glad to have you all with us this evening. So as I said, please do engage and respond throughout tonight's event. The chat's there for you to use. Please take advantage of it. So it's now my pleasure at this point to turn things over to my colleague, Professor Zinnia Kish, here at the University of Tulsa, who will be the moderator for this evening's panel. She's actually the lead fellow and seminar organizer for our Rage theme, and has been working tirelessly throughout the summer and this fall semester, helping us to both lead that seminar and bring together this dynamic group of scholars, students, and members of the community, while also helping us create public forums like this one that are timely, inventive, and engaging. This event tonight was entirely of her idea and her design. We're absolutely delighted that she was willing to put her energy and creativity in this, and we're really excited about the group of panelists that she's assembled for this evening and the topic that will guide our conversations as well. Professor Kish is an assistant professor of media studies here at TU, and her work focuses broadly on topics in American media and culture, including disaster capitalism, food studies, and the intersections of race and technology. So I hope you'll now join me in welcoming her to the center of your Zoom screens. I'm going to fade away into the background here as we get ready for this lively discussion of rage, race, and social media. So Zinnia, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Sean. Thank you to all of you for joining us. It looks like people have come from quite a wide range of geographies. It's really exciting. We even have an international audience. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight. And a big thank you to Sean and Tara for all of the organizing work you have done. There's a lot of behind the scenes and visible labor required to make these events run, especially now, our very first season fully online. So figuring out all the platforms, making this work for everybody. I know Sean and Tara are putting in a lot of time to really support a very rich season of programming for the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. So it's my pleasure to introduce our delightful guests for this evening's discussion. First, we have Dr. AJ Bauer, who is joining us. He is currently a visiting assistant professor at New York University's Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. And starting this spring, he will be taking up a position as assistant professor of journalism and creative media at the University of Alabama. So congratulations on that. Recently, AJ has been described as one of the most important emerging scholars of conservative media, and so we're really lucky to get his insights tonight. He is currently working on a book entitled Making the Liberal Media: Conservative Press Criticism and the Rise of the New Right. This important work traces how conservatives across much of the 20th century, beginning in the interwar period, have consolidated an oppositional alignment against mainstream media institutions. So his work really gives us an in-depth history that traces the discursive, regulatory, and institutional formations across 20th century media conservative institutions that have really helped to lay the groundwork for our media landscape today. So I'm very excited for this book to come out. It's going to really help us understand better why modern conservatism has become so preoccupied, maybe arguably defined, by challenging the credibility of mainstream news sources. He also recently co-edited the volume News on the Right, Studying Conservative News Cultures, which came out last year, co-edited with Anthony Nadler. This interesting book brings together scholars from different fields to analyze conservative news across various genres, formats, and historical moments. It includes interesting case studies ranging from the NRA TV to evangelical radio to Fox News's connection with country music. So definitely have a look at that. Professor Bauer is a former fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University and has worked extensively as a journalist, having edited and contributed to various publications from the Daily Texan, the Austin American Statesman, Boston Globe, Guardian, New Inquiry, and many others. So Professor Bauer's fascination with conservative media really began early. From my conversations with him, I understand that he's really had quite a lifetime of learning and exploring a lot of what it is that he now works on very seriously today. He told me recently that he grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh with his mom in Texas on the radio, and that I believe that that has really helped him understand and form a deep appreciation for the appeal of a lot of the media that he studies to its audiences. So thanks for joining us.
And you're very generous.
Also, we have Dr. Dannagal Goldthwaite Young joining us today. She is a political and social psychologist by training and is currently Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Delaware. She researches how our psychological traits shape how we approach culture and politics, and also how the economic incentives of partisan media structures intersect with these traits, exploiting our psychological tendencies and biases, often to help exacerbate divides while increasing engagement. So this work really helps us to understand why making us and keeping us angry can be profitable for media outlets, and why ironic political satire seems to thrive in so-called liberal media, but maybe not so much political talk radio, whereas we see the inverse in conservative media circles. Indeed, this was the gnawing question that helped inspire her recent book. She started out being asked and sort of puzzling over this question for quite some time. What's behind this truism that conservatives maybe aren't so good at satire, while liberals haven't really become successful at opinion talk shows? So what's behind that? How do we make sense of that? How true is that? It really drives her book, which is called Irony and Outrage: The Polarized Landscape of Fear, Rage, Fear, and Laughter in the United States. So this is a really interesting book, very engaging writing, filled with original research about the historical and recent transformations of both satirical and outrage programming across the political spectrum. Professor Young has published and appeared in numerous media outlets, from PBS NewsHour to Variety. And you can also catch her recent TED Talk, where she really lays out in a very clear format the heart of her research and her research questions. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of fun and relevant biographical facts. Dr. Goldthwaite Young is an improvisational comic and is part of a Philadelphia-based improv troupe, which is really exciting. She tells us this fascinating story in her book, where she got to work as a production assistant for The Daily Show back in 2000, and was chatting with then correspondent Stephen Colbert about her career options, weighing this decision: do I move to New York City and maybe start as a career in improv, or do I continue my graduate studies and go into a PhD program? So she relates this conversation with Colbert, who was telling her about, well, you have to consider the uncertainties of an early comic's life and early career. And he told her that if he'd had the chance to do a PhD at Penn, doing what he loved, he would have taken it. So she went on to kind of combine these things and went on to study the psychology of satire, which tied it all together. So this is all to say that she probably has a better career origin story than you or I. So without further ado, thank you both for joining us today. And just a quick introduction to the format. Each of our speakers is going to offer about a 5-minute opening statement just to draw out some of the key points that they're interested in connecting between their research and our broader topic for tonight and help set up the conversation. And then we'll transition into a conversation among the panelists. And I'll be trying to keep an eye on the chat and draw some of your questions in along the way as well. So thank you very much. And I'll turn the floor over to Professor Bauer.
Great, thank you, Xenia. Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm glad to be in Tulsa, even though I'm not in Tulsa. I wish that I were, and in better times, hopefully soon I will. All right, so I want to use my opening remarks to raise a kind of a counterintuitive question given tonight's theme, and that is, why is political rage so transfixing? Why do we fear it, and when should we? This is a question of pressing concern to my own research, which explores the long history of right-wing media and conservative news criticism in the United States, dating back to its origins in the 1930s and 40s. One thing I've noticed is a persistent fixation by journalists and scholars throughout history on conservative media as a fountain of political anger and a site of political outrage. This despite the fact that conservative media, or the conservative movement rather, has long drawn upon a wide range of political emotions and rationalities to rally and persuade their audiences. Rage, yes, anxiety, paranoia, victimhood, of course, but also humor, underdog appeals to reason, to accuracy, to facts, even to balance. Why does rage attract scholarly and journalistic attention and interest? And what does this interpretive attraction to rage cause us to overlook? Much of my work is designed to flesh out the aspects of conservative political culture that are obscured by our critical fixation on rage and anger of that culture's loudest voices. My questions here are informed by a cultural studies approach to conservative media, which I've developed in collaboration with Dr. Anthony Nadler of Ursinus College. In our book, News on the Right, we advocate for the study of conservative news cultures, which are the quotidian and historical production and consumption of conservative news and the circulation of that news within and beyond the modern conservative movement. Looking for the source of conservative rage, using this framework means accounting for the socio-historical conditions in which modern conservatism was cultivated, not only as an ideology, but also as a political identity. As it happens, in the late 1940s, conservatives were widely unpopular and struggling to gain influence within a political culture that had been fundamentally reshaped by FDR's New Deal and the Popular Front left liberal coalition that underwrote it. Here I have a quick show and tell, and Tara, if you could allow me to do the screen sharing would be great. This book that I'm going to just show you a couple of images from is called How to Be Popular Though Conservative. And this was a lighthearted political tract that was published by conservatives in 1948 and advertised in Reader's Digest, which at the time was a major source of conservative news and commentary. So here, I'll just go ahead and show it. So here what you're seeing, if you're seeing my screen, hopefully you are. Twinkle fingers if you are. Xenia, can you see it? Thank you. So here's the first image, which is a cartoon of a poor conservative who's returning to his wife after giving a speech on more economy and government, and the poor fellow has been tarred and feathered, right? Here's another cartoon where this young woman asks her father, "Daddy, is everyone who owns a Cadillac a fascist?" Right? So here what you're seeing is some humorous kind of self-deprecating humor that conservatives were having in the 40s, lamenting their kind of chronic unpopularity and inability to influence the public conversation, right? So the frustration of political misidentification, being called a fascist, and marginalization certainly informed a variant of conservative anger in the early days of modern conservative movement. Anger at liberals for holding the upper hand, anger at political agnostics for failing to realize the political reality as conservatives understood it, a reality in which race, gender, and class hierarchies were natural and mostly fixed, in which the free market naturally allocated value and resources to the most deserving, and in which state power promised only a slippery slope to socialism at home and communism abroad. Interestingly, The first grassroots mobilization of the modern conservative movement, H.L. Hunt's Facts Forum, which was a loosely coordinated constellation of discussion groups launched in 1952 and which later inspired radio and television programming, was not rooted in anger, but in balance. In 1949, the Federal Communication Commission initiated a policy called the Fairness Doctrine, which mandated that broadcasters over radio initially and later television cover issues of public controversy and that they do so in a way that balanced different ideological perspectives. H.L. Hunt devised Facts Forum to conform to this regulatory requirement, in doing so promoting the conservative worldview as the logical result of reasoned, impartial debate. This appearance of balance was criticized by journalists and scholars alike. The programming's unspoken right-wing bias was picked apart until Hunt folded the enterprise in 1956. Facts Forum was short-lived, but launched the careers of many influential conservative media and movement figures. William F. Buckley got his televisual debut on Facts Forum in the mid-1950s, just before launching the National Review magazine, as did Dan Smoot, a newsletter writer and radio commentator, who, as historian Nicole Hemmer and Dana herself have both pointed out in their books, was one of the radio commentators targeted by The Nation magazine in its 1964 expose of hate clubs on the air. The Reagan administration famously rescinded the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, paving the way for a commercially viable conservative talk radio, which, like its mid-century forebearers, has often been pigeonholed by its frequent appeals to rage and anger, but which also features considerable humor and information provision as well. So I'm by no means suggesting that rage and anger aren't indeed crucial animating emotions for the political right, as Dana's book clearly shows. By situating anger as one among many emotions and rationalities at play in the long history of modern conservatism, my work means to suggest that anger is not something that's unique or intrinsic to conservative ideology or identity, but rather that as an emotional style that attracts attention, anger is commercially lucrative, it's politically salient, and particularly prone to scholarly and journalistic scrutiny, and thus amplification. This framing is also meant to emphasize the fact that while conservatives make and consume media, they do so not under conditions of their own choosing. And so those are just my opening remarks. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks again for inviting me and to Xenia for that generous introduction.
That's great, really, really interesting opening thoughts, and establishing right from the beginning this longer historical genealogy that we're really interested in, and that informs everything about this conversation. Thank you, and now we'll turn it over to Professor Young.
Thank you so much. And Xenia, thank you for, as AJ said, for your generous introduction and for recalling that story about Stephen Colbert. Although I have to admit that part of me is wondering if what he was really trying to do was just get rid of the competition that he would have had in New York, right? I mean, let's be honest. I kid. So AJ, that was a great sort of platform to set to sort of talk about the fact that, yes, anger is able to be commodified, but that is not the sole function of the conservative media landscape. I've been doing some writing recently where I've been reflecting back on the work of sociologists from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and their concerns about different conceptualizations of groups of people. And so folks like Gabriel Tarde and Gustave Le Bon, who wrote about concerns about crowd behavior and the contagion effect that happens when people are in crowds. And, you know, that as much as people are physically disconnected from one another when they're in audiences for these kinds of programs, it does feel as though they do embody some characteristics of a crowd, particularly with regards to the contagion and the contagion of visceral emotions, especially anger. Because when you have a group of people who are energized, right, who feel a sense of community and are energized, the argument was that the target of their energies could be very quickly shifted, that they were very suggestible in terms of what would be the target of their ire. And I find it interesting to think about how those same writings from about a century ago could be applied in the context of the audiences for some of these programs today. And not necessarily even just those programs, but also in the context of social media groups, like far right-wing social media groups who put new targets and new enemies, you know, bring new things to light to sort of attract the attention of folks. And I just want to say the work that I do came out of about I'm going to say 15 years of quantitative studies and experimental survey research on the effects of exposure to political satire on opinions and knowledge and behaviors. And so, running experiments, doing surveys, trying to understand what happens to people who are chronically exposed to late night political jokes. What happens if you expose people to late night political jokes, or if you expose them to serious versions of those same arguments? What happens to their thoughts? What happens to the salience of the things that are on their minds, etc. And I found interesting effects of exposure, and it allowed me enough research to get tenure. However, there was something that I could never figure out, as Zinnia alluded to, which is the idea that there were very few examples of conservative political satire. And so once I started unpacking that question, like, why is that? That kind of opened this whole can of worms. And the can of worms that I opened was the can of worms of political psychology. So the crux of the argument that I explore in the book is the fact that it's not just random that liberals articulate their political critiques through humor and conservatives do so through this genre of programming that's sort of opinion talk, right? Something that Jeff Berry and Sarah Soberai call outrage programming. That's not just random, that actually is a result of the fact that there are two very different ways of sort of orienting to and engaging with the world that come from our psychological and personality traits, and also even as far down as sort of our genetics, our biology, and our physiological responses to things. And I don't want to be accused of being overly deterministic here, because these are not fixed, these are not immutable. All of these things are of course affected by sociological factors and context and life experience, right? However, all things being equal, it is the case that those individuals who tend to be more likely to be monitoring their environments for threats, those people tend to then be less tolerant of ambiguity, have a higher need for predictability, be less appreciative of novelty. And they also like to make decisions quickly, motivated by efficiency and cognitive shortcuts. Okay. And these individuals also tend to be our social and cultural conservatives. And these individuals tend to also have certain kinds of aesthetic preferences for things like realistic art, stories with a clear ending, certain kinds of predictable musical structures like popular music, country music. And on the other side, those folks who are not oriented towards threat, those folks they're at kind of a luxurious position because they're not as busy trying to make sure that, they're not going to be eaten by a bear. And this kind of opens them up to be able to think for the sake of thinking. They're not as concerned about being in environments that are predictable and safe. They're more open to things like experimentation, and curiosity can bring them wherever because they're not so concerned about what threat lurks around the next corner. So the case that I make is that the reason that these two genres look so different, and the reason that we see these sort of ideological biases of these genres, is because of the underlying psychological traits that accompany liberalism and conservatism. However, to the fact that these are not immutable, many people have noticed, and we all have noticed, I'm sure, that the jokes that are coming out of liberal satirists, especially since Trump was elected, are more angry, right? They look a little bit more like outrage. Folks like Samantha Bee and sometimes Stephen Colbert, there's not a lot of irony there. There is a lot of straight up, I'm angry, and here's what I'm angry about. And so that to me speaks to the notion that even if these folks are more tolerant of ambiguity, which may make them more open to being playful, it's not as though they have infinite capacity for threat. And I think in the context of this administration, I think that for these liberal satirists, threat is salient, which makes them then express themselves in ways that perhaps look a little bit more like conservatives. I also wanted to say, and I hope we can come back to this, I'm asked a lot about, well, let me frame that differently. Not all liberals are just ready to have a good time and be playful and express themselves through jokes. Many liberal activists find these modes of expression to be trite And they get frustrated at the fact that there are folks who are expressing themselves through like play when it is time to be angry. When the stakes are so high, it is time to be angry. And we see this especially in the context of things like social justice and racial justice. In my estimation, that again speaks to this notion that there's not infinite capacity for play. It's not that their threats are never salient for people who identify as liberal, and that under certain circumstances, yes, threats are present. And when I see, one of the things about the psychology of humor that I find most intriguing is that threat and play are diametrically opposed. If you are imminently under a condition of threat, it is very difficult to be lighthearted and playful. And this seems intuitive, right? This isn't like, this is what social scientists do. We like find empirical evidence for things that we know are true. But I think there are reasons sort of evolutionarily why that would be the case. And I'll just end with this fascinating conversation that I had when I was talking with Sam Sater, who's the host of the Majority Report. Sam Sater used to be on Air America, which was the liberal response to like Rush Limbaugh. And Sam Sater he started out as like a comic, and his sense was that the stakes were too high and that the issues were too serious. And he got frustrated with those liberal satirists like a Jon Stewart or a Stephen Colbert who turned everything into a joke. And so he would come at things with anger. He would come at things with outrage. And folks would then say to him, "You're not funny anymore. You lost your funny," right? And he would say, "I don't care. My goal is not to be funny. My goal is to be truthful." So I think there is this inherent tension on the left between what is the smart use of anger? When is anger acceptable? When is anger needed? And are there some conditions under which we should not be playful? So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. And I love how you both add more questions to our conversation. So we've got a lot to work with here. So maybe considering the deep historical roots of both of your research and how important it is to make those connections and really not fall prey to this popular discourse that we hear everywhere now, that, oh, social media has created these bubbles, these echo chambers, that social media is the root cause of polarization, and that the outrage programming that we see all around us or feel resonating through us is really a new product somehow of this digital media moment. So I'm interested in sort of thinking about even social media much more broadly than our current digital platforms. And ask you both to sort of draw out a couple of the sort of historical roots of our current moment of outrage culture that you think are really pertinent or perhaps overlooked, that might help us better understand and contextualize what it is that we're seeing. And AJ already started speaking to this in his comments as well, but I know both of your book projects are really rich in these areas.
Dana, would you like to go first?
No, go ahead.
So I think that there's a lot of different pathways into this, right? And I think that for me, my therapist is surely not watching because I'm sure he doesn't know that this is even happening, but if he did, he would be laughing because I have this interpersonal problem with expressing of anger. And so what I'm about to say is going to be very funny to him when I tell him about this. But in any event, to me, the thing that underpins anger is disagreement. Right, and it's an emotional expression of disagreement and an elevated emotional expression of disagreement to some extent, right? And so I feel like a lot of the debate and the fears and the kind of hand wringing around anger and frustration and the problem of it, right, is often masking a fundamental disagreement that people are not always engaging with when they're concerned with this question of anger. And one piece of my opening remarks that I wanted to get at a little bit more deeply that's connected to this is, so for most of the 20th century, right? So from the late 1940s through the mid to late 1980s, there was, and this is a time period in the middle of that Dan Howland calls the high modern period of American journalism, right? So this is a time period where Americans' news diets, right, were had an expectation of impartiality, right? Most people got their news and information from one of the big three television networks, CBS, ABC, NBC, right? That was what was on during dinner. You couldn't tune into like sports or ESPN or something like that for a good chunk in the middle of the 20th century. This created a kind of like synchronicity of news diets among many Americans. And the character of that news diet was shaped partly by this fairness doctrine imposition of fair and balanced reporting, impartiality, etc. And this journalistic value also existed within a lot of print journalism. This was a time period where there was consolidation. A lot of newspapers, towns that were like multi-newspaper towns consolidated into one newspaper town. So it wasn't a matter of like the Democratic Party paper and the Republican Party paper anymore. It was just the one paper. But all of that expectation of like a consistent and stable, impartial news environment, right, created the conditions whereby anger was seen as politically aberrant. And conservatism, for one of the reasons why conservatism itself was kind of seen or developed a kind of victimhood complex throughout this time period, was because a lot of conservatives, like Dan Smoot, like I'd mentioned, or Carl McIntyre, right, many of whom were very loud and vociferous and angry and other things too, but they were seen as kind of a political threat, right? Partly because of this expression of anger, which was seen as kind of like an excess of political emotion versus this kind of staid, impartial version of politics that was being depicted on the news, right? Similarly, at the same time, right, you see the rise in the 60s of the New Left or of the Black Panther Party or of queer liberation or these other movements who are also seen as politically aberrant, right? Partly because of this unauthorized expression of political emotion, or at least expression of political emotion that was beyond the kind of expectations of mainstream discourse. And so I think one thing about going back to kind of like you had mentioned, Dana, about like crowd psychology, right? Going back to like Le Bon, right? Is that early kind of moment of analyzing crowd behavior pathologized it, right? And pathologized social movements and any forms of expression of politics outside of kind of like rational voting, et cetera. And so one way that I think about anger, and I'll stop talking and let others talk, but one way that I think about anger is it's what happened, or it's something that's often used within the US political context to define politics that have gone too far, right? In an attempt to rein politics back into a really confined space. And so this is why I think anger is actually, and this is why my therapist would be happy with this moment, right? Is that anger, as Zach De La Roca from Rage Against the Machine says, right? Anger is a gift, right? It is a gift to engage in anger for political purposes. It's a gift that US political culture for most of the 20th century did not grant to people. So anyway, that's my kind of riff. Sorry.
So I would like to, I think the question, Zandia, was sort of where are the roots of all of this concern about anger, that it's not just from social media, right? So, and I super appreciate the historical perspective that AJ brings to bear. I mean, the idea, this is where this gets really tricky, and why there were certain chapters of my book that I just felt like I'm so linear in how I think, because I'm a quantitative social psychologist, that to think institutionally about things that were all reciprocally related was very challenging. The idea that like, okay, so what comes first? The political polarization, the media fragmentation, the loss of trust in the news, the loss of trust in government. That's a very tricky narrative to weave. So, but I'll try to put it together the way that I see it. And that is that, like AJ spoke about the sort of that high modern era of news, which then towards the end of that, we have consolidation of media ownership, which is happening at the very same time that trust in news is already starting to decline, in part because of an increase in political polarization that's happening starting in like the 90s, where elites of the Democratic and Republican Party are having issue positions that are slightly more farther away from the center. That then trickles down to the public, right? You also have a reduction in trust in government stemming from Watergate and Vietnam. You also have a change in media technology. So not just do you have this change in the ownership structure of news, but you also have new technologies, right, where you have the rise of cable. So you have media fragmentation, which simply means an explosion in the number of outlets that are available. then you have the accompanying change in the economics of those media, because instead of selling giant mass audiences to advertisers, like national advertisers, now you have these outlets who are like, hey, advertisers, I have this teeny tiny audience that I want to sell you. But guess what? They are all between the age of 18 and 24, and they're all dudes, and they all like to drive cars. And they all like to drive a particular kind of car. So it becomes sort of this, niche target marketing machine, not quite of the magnitude that we have on Facebook, but it is the precursor to that. And the reason that all of that is important is that as all this stuff is happening in the background with political polarization and a reduction in trust and the sort of commodification of news and the gutting of newsrooms, you also have the fact that then the public is increasingly difficult to sort of please in terms of their news preferences. And we have this finding of what's called the hostile media effect, which is actually cognitively, it's a perceptual error in judgment that we make when liberals are exposed to news that is objective or neutral, or when conservatives are exposed to news that is objective or neutral. Both of them see that information as biased against their side. And that comes about in part because when you tend to be in an echo chamber or a filter bubble, and when you anchor yourself in a political position where the baseline is skewed, anything outside of that baseline is going to look biased. So the hostile media effect means that now people who are increasingly polarized, increasingly distrustful of large institutions like government or media, their preferences for news are quite specific in terms of they are going to want information that tells them what they want to hear. And not just that, they are going to perceive information outside of that as fundamentally biased or even untrue. That creates an appetite for and an opening, especially through the creation of all these new outlets, for news programming, alternative forms of news programming that kind of look news-ish, but aren't really, but are also ideological and are responses to this decline in that high modern era of journalism, which is what Fox News is, and which is what The Daily Show on Comedy Central is. These are both responses to this sort of, all of these massive changes and this sort of turn away from that high modern ideal. And finally, I want to say, the reason that all this matters and the reason that all this is related to social media is because I put the economics of the media environment at the heart of what drives these things. I mean, we wouldn't have had Fox News if it weren't for the economics of media fragmentation. We would not have had Comedy Central if not for the economics of media fragmentation. In the same way that we would not have flat earther groups or anti-vax groups if not for the economics of micro-targeting facilitated through digital technologies and social media platforms. I think maybe that answers the question. I think.
That's great, thank you. And I'll just pause for a moment to remind everyone in our audience that that chat window is open. There's actually a lively conversation going on, but that's also a great place to pose questions to the panelists as well. And I'll keep an eye out for questions. There's an interesting conversation going on about different uses of anger, and also really the links between anger and identity, and how our individual identity gets wrapped up in different emotional expressions, but then also how that translates to our relationships with institutions and so forth. So that's, I think that's opens up, and connects with a lot of what it is that you're offering us here, and ties in one of the other themes that we've already been sort of thinking about, which is to what extent do these expressions of anger constitute forms of entertainment? What are the forms of pleasure that we gain from them? Why is it so easily bound up in expressions of identity? And how is it that we see the emergence of something like QAnon, which more and more people are sort of analyzing as having a strong sense of community formation, as bringing people together in a moment. It's not just conspiracy theory to explain, what's going on, but it's really a sense of bonding and identity formation. So maybe thinking about those connections between anger, identity, and pleasure.
I would love to just take a stab at this because it also ties back to something that AJ said. So I have been, doing a lot of sort of writing and talking about ideas related to misinformation and conspiracy theory beliefs. And one of the things that is really tricky with dealing with and writing about misinformation and tackling this issue of misinformation is that the information itself is besides the point. The information does not matter. Right? Now, it matters in terms of the effect that information may have down the road, but in terms of what is driving these communities, it has nothing to do with the information. It is all about identity. It's about who I am. It's about these social allegiances. And so I'm speaking to my own field here as political communication scholars. If we keep thinking of this as an information problem, we're going to be going down the wrong rabbit hole, because it's not an information problem, it's an identity problem. It's also a problem of trust in institutions, which again has nothing to do with the content of the information. It's not about the pizza parlor. It's not about if the earth is flat. It's about trust in science. It's about trust in health officials, trust in government, trust in scholars, trust in academia, right? Which brings me to my second point. When AJ, when you were talking about anger as a response to some kind of disagreement, I think that is true. And I think you would agree with what I'm about to say, which is that we tend to think of disagreement as something that is rational and issue-based, something that is more about argumentation. And as I'm sure you would agree, it's not. A lot of times disagreement has nothing to do with information. So I think about the anger that I witness in online contexts as a woman who is a scholar who speaks out with authority about issues. There is an anger that is directed at me that has nothing to do with the content that I am saying. It is anger that is aimed at the fact that I am a woman and I am speaking. And I am a woman and I am an expert and I'm speaking. And the disagreement is, I should not be doing this, or I should not be allowed to do this. And I think that's where we get all tangled up, because we want to sort of deal with it as though it's about the information and the content of the argument, but it's not. It's about issues of respect and trust and tradition and identity.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, right? Like I think you're right that the question of disagreement is often articulated in like a rational, critical way, which again is, I think, a misunderstanding of what disagreement is. Because like you said, oftentimes, especially in this country, which is lousy with racism and sexism and homophobia, right? Much of disagreement is actually about existential disagreement. I disagree with you categorically and your ability to either live or to do the thing you're doing or to love the person you're loving or whatever it would be, right? And so this is one reason why politics has such intense stakes in this country. But it's also one reason why like that mainstream politics has for a long time, at least in the middle 20th century, been terrified of anger, right? Because a lot of the anger that was bristling up, right, was people who are facing these kind of existential disagreements, that they're being constitutively defined out of the body politic or brutally beaten for attempting to be a part of the body politic, right? But I also really appreciate, Dana, your point about it not being about the information itself, right? But being rather about the kind of social ties and binds that this comes together. And I think I would reframe it just a little bit is less a matter of like individual identity and more about the kind of collective identity that emerges in social movement formation. And so one thing that this brings up for me is, everybody's been asking me about QAnon, and I waited as long as I could to figure out what it was, because I was like, I just don't have the mental space. It's too complicated and sounds just ridiculous. Like, really, John F. Kennedy Jr.? Come on, like, why? Why is this like, I'm waiting for the conspiracy theory with Princess Diana comes in and, saves us, like it's insane. But anyway, I think the closest corollary, though, that I can imagine in the US political culture, right, is the John Birch Society, right, which was famous in the late 1950s and into the 60s, was like tarred and lambasted for being absurd. Everybody was a communist or had some kind of connection to communism, right? It was this height of Cold War hysteria. But one thing that stood out to me about the John Birch Society is it's often thought of in this historical context as though it's this thing that happened in the past, and then William F. Buckley kicked them out of the movement and they disappeared forever and blah, blah, blah. So 10 years ago now, wow, I was doing ethnographic research with the Tea Party movement, and I was going around and I was doing in-depth interviews with Tea Partiers in Massachusetts and in Texas. And all
I think AJ froze briefly. Hopefully he'll return to us.
Oh no. I want to know what he found when he did his ethnographic research with the Tea Party movement.
I know the man was on a roll.
That was great. Where did he go?
All right, he might need to refresh and start in.
He
Okay.
might need to refresh. I will say I absolutely agree with the idea that yes, it's not necessarily about individual identity. AJ said yes, it's not about information. It's about these collective identities, which I would absolutely agree with. It's about the tapping into these primal sort of social associations. We talk a lot about how we are social animals, and oh, there he's back.
Oh, great. Okay.
I was totally just ad-libbing because I want to hear about the Tea Party movement ethnography.
Sorry. I have no idea what happened, but I'm back apparently. So where did I leave off? Oh, so I was talking about the Tea Party movement. So the John Birch Society is framed as this thing that disappeared a long time ago. It's long dead, right? A lot of the folks that I interviewed though remembered it, and not just like as an abstract memory, like they joined it. they were like part of it.
Wow.
And in addition to being
Can I just pause for 1 second? Sorry to interrupt, AJ, but just for the benefit of all the generations in our conversation, do you want to just briefly explain what the John Birch Society is in case people aren't?
Yeah. So the John Birch Society was founded in, I think it was 56, by Robert Welsh, who was a famous candy family, in Massachusetts.
It was a candy magnate. I just like the word magnate.
Candy magnate, yes. It was a vehemently anti-communist organization that basically thought that the Soviet Union was conspiring to overthrow the United States. It was a proponent and supporter of the McCarthy phenomenon and McCarthyism. It was a proponent of the argument that the civil rights movement was basically communist agitation, that it was, basically a lot of the conspiracy, or a lot of the kind of like social and progressive developments that were going on at that era, it had some kind of like, either anti-Semitic or racist or anti-communist kind of plot behind it.
And super isolationist, right? Get the United States out of the United Nations. Earl Warren is the worst thing ever on the Supreme Court. And also engaging in mis and disinformation, putting up billboards with pictures that claim to show Martin Luther King Jr. at a communism school.
Yeah, for sure, totally. So the interesting finding, at least, right, is talking to these Tea Partiers, is many of them knew one another or knew of other people that connected them to the Tea Party movement through connections that they built within the John Birch Society. And so thinking about the long history of the conservative movement as not just like individuals going and acting, but as they join the movement, they meet older people in the movement who have been around longer and remember the good old days with with Goldwater and stuff like that, right? And they impart political knowledge and information and styles and habits and emotions, right? That then get picked up by that next generation. And so part of what we're dealing with here is not just kind of, not only on that individual cognitive level, although that's also part of it, right? But it's also about like what sorts of alliances, like literally like connections you're building with others that you end up making friends with and then organizing with on a variety of projects. So I forget the initial thing because of the dropout and everything, but anyway, I'll leave it to you, Dana, to keep it going.
I wanted to ask you a question, AJ, that I keep coming back to the idea that there was this really seemingly sort of hostile dynamic that existed between Buckley and Welsh. Mm-hmm. And, Buckley wouldn't let Welsh in the pages of the National Review, which was that was the document of record for the conservative movement at the time. Yeah. And so when I think about the concept of elite gatekeepers and the folks who control the flow of information, mm-hmm. I really like that example because I think it was Charlie Sykes framed it as William F. Buckley kept the crackpots out of the pages of the National Review. Right. And so as we see the rise of digital technologies and we see, decreasing trust in institutions and elites, we see the reduction in the role of elite gatekeepers. And I just wonder if what you think about the possibility that the reason that the sort of John Birch Society iterations that we see now are more appealing and able to enter the mainstream. Is that just about the declining role of gatekeepers, or is it more about sort of fundamental societal changes in terms of people feeling empowered and profound doubt in the institutions that used to be in power? Or is it just about the gatekeepers? We don't have the William F. Buckleys deciding what gets in the pages or not.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an answer that I think you'll appreciate as an improver, Dana, which is yes and, right? So one point to note about this, the kicking, the gatekeeping moment, right, where Buckley kicks the Welsh out of the pages, et cetera, is the part of that that goes unnarrated is the proliferation of John Birch Society periodicals and newspapers that happens as a result of that. There are multiple magazines. One is called Review of the News. Another is called, I know it changes, another one changes names a few times, still exists, like American Opinion, I think. But these still circulated among the fringe right in a way that, like, when, what's his name, Milo gets kicked off of whatever it is, right? He pops up in another space or opens a new newsletter or whatever. Like the gatekeeping analogy makes it seem as though it's that easy, right? When really these things kind of circulate around. That being said, I think that there is something about right now when a Milo or somebody like that gets deplatformed or gets kicked off in some way, that by engaging in spectacle, right, or outlandishness, right, that there's a sort of fascination in the coverage of mainstream media that is like attracted to that and continues to report on it often. And so,
right. Well, you know what? Just think about today with The Intercept and Glenn Greenwald, right? How many journalists and how many reporters and how many media organizations were sort of obsessed on Twitter with this event, that this conservative writer has basically left the publication that he founded and is going to, go rogue and do his own, what's it called? The Substack, is that what it's called?
Yeah,
basically do one of these newsletters. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, because it's almost like it's so shiny, they can't not talk about it. And so then that thing that is maybe not that substantively important becomes important and becomes talked about.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, it also gets at this idea is that the media ecosystem now is not just that kind of objective reporters or whatever. So even if they were to collude and decide they wanted to not cover something, Fox or Breitbart or whomever will cover it. And then it'll be, for all their audiences, oh, well, why isn't the New York Times covering this, right? Which I'm hearing even from my students, which they're saying, why isn't the Times covering this Biden? Like, I forget even whatever the allegation was. I was like, well, because there's no facts behind it. And they're like, yeah, but when are they going to cover it to debunk it, right? Which is the whole Pizzagate phenomenon all over again, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's very interesting to see these arguments that we're hearing now among conservative politicians who are bringing in the Silicon Valley tech CEOs, for instance, for questioning and sort of making these claims about bias and censorship and being shut out of these media platforms, coming back around and replaying arguments that they really fought to defeat in the 80s by ending the fairness doctrine and saying we don't want media that is expected to have equal and balanced and fair representation from all sides. And now these cries for censorship in this highly fragmented and digital and competitive media landscape. And this is a lot of the questions that I'm seeing here kind of come back to this. Well, what do we do in this particular moment with this media landscape that we have? But also we can't romanticize that high modernist or earlier media moment either. That clearly didn't work well for us. So I'm interested in what you think about this politicization or strategy right now of conservatives sort of crying foul that, well, you're persecuting us, you're marginalizing us, or censoring us.
I mean, I think that they're going to do it no matter what, right? And so then the question becomes, well, then do it and then deal with the consequences is one approach, right? But I think that this is something I've had a lot of conversations with colleagues about of, well, how do you anticipate the fact that conservatives are going to react to it or going to, call you a liberal or a censor or whatever? And their entire political culture is around doing that. They're going to find a way to do it anyway. And so the question is like, at some point when you're trying to do that anticipation game and game out what your opponent is going to do, you wind up ceding terrain by doing that. And so I think the questions that are operative to the left should be more independent of what they think the right is going to do. Dana?
Hold on. That was a Zoom foul. I forgot I was muted. I also think that, you know, like AJ's work talks about the conservative media sort of articulating itself as a response, or the conservative media establishment articulates itself as a response to mainstream media. It does feel as though they cannot exist without mainstream media. I mean, so it's not even, these are opinion organizations, information organizations that are created as foils to mainstream journalism. And they will do that, and they will continue to do that. And it's almost like the policy and the politics are a little bit besides the point. It's all about this sort of antagonistic relationship with the mainstream press. So I think legacy news organizations just need to continue doing what they do. It's wild. I mean, I read the New York Times and Washington Post, and you do get the sense that they are just continuing to keep their nose to the grindstone, just plowing away one thing after another. And the same is true at the Wall Street Journal even, right? Where they're like, with this latest thing with the Hunter Biden allegations in this laptop, they're like, all right, well, we'll look at this. Oh, we looked at it. It is not credible. Joe Biden has done nothing wrong. So if you want a piece about that, that's going to be an expose, that will have to be in our opinion pages. And so it's almost like they have to shut that out. They have to be like the horse with blinders on, because otherwise you could get so distracted. It almost reminds me of that first horrible debate, the presidential debate, where there were all these interruptions. I mean, Trump was sort of the embodiment of the conservative media ecosystem, right? All these interruptions, all this goading, all this mocking, so much so that like Biden could not quite get his footing enough to make his points, to answer a question. He started responding. And, you know, a lot of folks are like, why was he responding? Why would you respond? That I would see as a strategic error on his part. And I think that what we're seeing is the mainstream legacy press are like, they're not Bidening it, right? They're just like, no, don't do that. Don't go over there. Just keep at it, you know?
I definitely think that's the case, but I also think it's interesting that, so like the Wall Street Journal was like, I don't want to touch this Biden whatever laptop situation. And so then they're like, all right, we'll send it down to the Post. Right. And then the Post covers it. But the most interesting thing about that to me, as somebody who's interviewed some conservative journalists as a part of a different project, the conservative news work at the Tao Center, is that there was like a hot potato situation, right? Where somebody was like, okay, we wrote the story. And then he was like, I don't want my byline on it. And everybody was like, okay, put your byline. Oh no, not my byline. Right. But I think the interesting thing there is this, getting back to the kind of, individual psychology of it, right? Is that these individual journalists that work for the Post or work for other conservative outlets that do see themselves as reporters and journalists, they still have some of those values of like wanting to be seen as accurate, not wanting your credibility diminished with your audience, et cetera. And so there's these little ways that like those traditional journalistic values are still woven in there, and you can see them flare up in these moments, but there are bigger structural reasons why they can't.
Right. So even at these other publications, there's still a sense that like nobody wants to have their reputation tarnished as a result of this. I would say if anyone is interested in sort of a deep dive into those negotiations over how that story got covered, and the fact that the White House was not able to get the bombshell story that they wanted to land out of these allegations. Ben Smith has a wonderful longer piece in the New York Times from 4 days ago about that. That's worth your time.
Yeah, +1. I agree with that.
+1.
Great. Add it to our reading list. So I imagine that both of you are probably much closer to a lot of what's happening in this media ecosystem than many of our audience. And I'm curious what you're seeing recently and right now that you think is perhaps most significant or maybe most surprising in terms of new developments or changes? We don't seem to be on the verge of having a conservative-driven, a Facebook rival or anything like that, but the way that that the politics is reshaping what is and isn't passable within our social media. But there's just so many interesting things happening right now with Fox News having really weathered pretty unscathed many of its recent scandals and high profile letting go of very problematic personalities and so forth. And yet they've just had history's greatest cable news month of ratings of all time. So they're soaring high. We also see things like the Lincoln Project is now stepping forward and sort of transitioning to some kind of business media empire or whatever that becomes. So what is it that you're paying attention to right now that you think is interesting or important for us to keep an eye on?
I've got two things, and since I think I'm a lot older than AJ, so my memory's not as good, I want to go first so I don't forget them. Number one, I think it's fascinating to observe how the conservative media landscape, I would just say Fox News, how Fox News is dealing with this Trump conundrum right now. And I call it a conundrum because, it does seem that the polls are suggesting that it's possible that Trump could lose. Now, I'm not going to come out here confidently saying one thing or another because, I was alive in 2016. I saw how that played out. But it is possible that Trump will not win. That being said, recall what Fox News is in the business of. They are not a political party. They are not senators and congresspeople who are trying to advance legislation. They are I keep saying news organization. They are a media organization who is looking to make a profit. And one thing that we know for sure is that Barack Obama was very, very lucrative for Fox News, very lucrative. And that money did not come from their straight news shows. That money came from their opinion programming. And so while on the one hand, there might be sort of a desire, and I think an organic ideological desire to have a Republican in the White House, I'm sure they're also ready, willing, and able to pivot as need be to be able to capitalize on what will be a very lucrative situation. So I'm interested in watching that. Like, how's that going to play out? I also have been really fascinated by watching some of the tech platforms dealing with it could be a crisis in terms of the election and mis and disinformation and hateful and harmful speech and speech that incites violence on those platforms. It's funny because these seem like such insignificant changes and insignificant interventions, but on Twitter, what we've seen is some pretty big decisions, refusing to accept any money for political advertising at all, number one, which I don't necessarily see as a good thing. I mean, I think that there are grassroots organizations and social movements that, gosh, could really use that kind of visibility, but they're just like, we are taking ourselves out of this equation, period. I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting that these are platforms that have brought on social psychologists to really think about ways to, after years of them trying to make Twitter so habitual that it's almost like an extension of yourself, right? To get people in the flow. Now they're trying to interrupt the flow. They're trying to put in speed bumps. They're trying to say, wait, do you really want to share this story? You haven't actually read it yet. Hi, right? Or, hey, you want to retweet that? That's fine. You got to put some context with it. You got to have a quote with that. You got to share something of your own original thought before you retweet that. All of these are little speed bumps that actually over time could have some kind of significant impact. I want to see the data on that. I do not know that we will, but I want to know on the other side how those interventions change things. I just think it's also interesting that they finally recognize that perhaps they had some kind of a role to play as arbiter, perhaps not as fact checker, but as the slower downer, as the speed bump.
I desperately want some speed bumps. I feel like we've been going so fast and I'm so tired. But that brings me to, not like in this, but in existentially. I think the thing that keeps me up at night, or that I've been lately becoming aware of, is I think we take for granted presidents disappearing for a while after they lose. George W. Bush disappeared to Crawford and to Dallas, right? Did his paintings. Obama disappeared for a while, like didn't really reemerge for a while, even though he opposed things that Trump was doing. He like stayed out of it, right? Trump isn't going anywhere, right? What happens if okay, let's say like, God willing, right? We have a Biden landslide. It's indisputable. There's no way that Trump can like use lawsuits or whatever to say that he's actually the winner, right? Let's say that happens. I'm not predicting anything because like Dana, I survived 2016 and I'm not doing that again. But, and I was wrong. I did not predict Trump. So don't listen to me in my predictions. But Trump isn't going anywhere. He may create his own network to compete with Fox. He may become the new Hannity, right? He may be the new Fox like anchor guy, or like 8 o'clock guy or 9 o'clock guy. That's the thing.
He's going to have like $900 million of debt coming. He's going to have to pay for it somehow, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And still 84 million, whatever, Twitter followers, right? Like, and so I keep telling my students this too, where it's like, we all think that November 3rd is going to be that time where we get relief, and we're just never, it's not going to come. And so that's, I think, what I'm fixated on. Is like, what does the conservative media landscape look like when Trump is no longer a president and doesn't have that bully pulpit, but still has, you know, his enormous Twitter presence and like is not going to shut up ever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's also true to ask of depending on how things go in the Senate and elsewhere. I mean, the Republican Party was much better at critiquing the healthcare plan than ever coming up with a replacement for it. So that oppositional stance can be very productive and as you say, lucrative for these groups. So one of the things that it came up, we have a teacher or a professor in the chat who's sort of asking about how do we engage with our students thinking about politics and the importance of political rhetoric and not just sort of shutting down like, oh, that's political or that's biased, I don't want to think about it. What are maybe in the classroom or elsewhere in your work or in your sort of political life, what are some of the ways that you see the most productive uses of political rage in our contemporary moment? What are the ways that you see it linked to positive social change?
Sure. So I wanted to answer the first half of that question. In my classes, my students are overwhelmingly liberal. And that's not necessarily true at my university as a whole, but it is in the communication department and the courses that I teach. And so there is an assumption, I think, on the part of many of them that they can sort of speak in these ways that are often sort of ad hominem attacks aimed at the right or at conservatives. And I feel like it is my job to move them beyond that because I just feel like it's not helpful. And one of the things that I try to do, and this is a drum that I continue to beat, which is when folks are talking about information that they, or beliefs that they have that are unfounded, this is for both the left and the right. Just asking questions is sort of such a wonderful tool. Asking questions, not in like a, why are you so stupid kind of way, but asking questions like, where did you get that information? Why, it seems important to you that that's true. Why is that important to you that is true? And then my favorite is there any information from any source that I could introduce to you that would convince you that you're wrong? At which point a lot of folks truly concede, no, there's literally nothing you could tell me that would change my mind. At which point, can I just say it's so freeing? Because then you're like, well, then we're done. Because this isn't about, again, it's not about the information. It's about identity. It's about emotions. So now, and you're done, and you have revealed to that person, and you can say, well, then, if there literally is no empirical information that could be brought to light that would change your view, then this isn't actually about what's factual. And sometimes people are like, angry about that. But it also sometimes is like a light bulb goes off. So I find those kinds of exchanges with students pretty useful.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think all of those are really great questions to ask. I think I view this in a couple of ways. And I think that one of the things that is challenging, and again, this being about anger, is to avoid anger with your students. And I think that what Donna just said about reconciling yourself to the fact that you're probably not going to convince them, right? You may not at all, is one way you can temper that for educators, right? Is that there's no need to be frustrated and angry with them. You're not going to like single-handedly carry the student into whatever information world you want them to be in. So two things that I do. One is even especially with conservative students who often seek me out because I study conservatism, and some of them are like, oh, you understand at least, and all this kind of thing. I often make myself pretty available to talking to them about things that are outside of class, like even politics and things like that. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll push them on issues. Oftentimes they'll want to talk about race, or they'll want to talk about gender identity. A lot of times is really popular for students, or really conservative students are very anxious about it. And a lot of times I'll talk with them at length about this. Partly it's kind of like it's a harm mitigation, right? Which is like, if they can ask me a bunch of like insensitive questions, they might not ask like a trans kid that, right? Or a Black kid in class that, right? Most of the time, these are white students who are white cis students who are asking these questions. So I kind of let myself take some of that just in hopes that maybe it they get it out of their system a little. I know that that's probably not true, but like at least something as a buffer. The other thing that I do is I try to ask them what information they use and ask them to send it to me. And one experience I had with this that was really helpful was I was teaching a sports journalism class at Ursinus College, actually, a few years ago. And I was teaching, it was a kind of trick class because it was about like how to cover race, gender, and class through sports journalism, and a lot of them were not really having it. But at one point we were in a discussion about pay equity in tennis. And one of the students said, there's no such thing as pay inequality between men and women. And I said, oh, really? Like, because there is, like, where are you getting that from? And he said, Ben Shapiro told me. It's like, all right, send me that link. Send me that link of Ben Shapiro. And so he sent it to me, and I went home and I listened to it. And in it, Ben Shapiro cites some article from Newsweek or something, or Time Magazine from 2010. And the article actually says that pay gap does exist, unless like 30 different categories or something like that. So I just printed that off and brought it in and said, hey, everybody, your colleague on the other day said that this doesn't exist. He said Ben Shapiro. Here's Ben Shapiro's source. Everybody read it. And they all read it. And I said, what do we notice about this argument of this source? And they were like, it says the gender pay gap exists. I was like, what did we learn? And so it worked pretty well. And if you have like a playful relationship with your students, you can do this without raising ire and things like that. But I recommend like pushing them a little. Like that's what education's about, is pushing them, pushing all of us into like think things we didn't consider before. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
That's great. Great, really fun examples. So many of us, I think, are teachers and students and working our way through all of these things, and we'll continue to post-election and wherever we go in the coming years. So another theme that's come up and that I've been thinking about is, especially through our RAGE seminar, we're really focused on a lot of these incredibly powerful mobilizations of RAGE for social change. Black Lives Matter right now, and you know, the ebbing and flowing of feminist rage taking different forms and different movements, and Women's March and Me Too and so forth. And so on the one hand, it seems like people are interested in sort of thinking through, well, there's such rewards to expressions of anger. How do we recalibrate or maybe pull back or I don't know, make our political discourse more healthy somehow, and move away from such highly charged intercourse. But at the same time, it's this drive, this rage-driven social movements are really helping to push forward so much of what we need to be doing right now to continue progressing and expanding rights and equalities and so forth. So how do we think about moving forward into a healthy form of discourse that helps us steer away from the more dangerous forms of outrage and yet continue to nourish the political fuel that we need that can be rage rooted.
I think about this. I don't know if this is exactly what you were referring to. I think about this not just in terms of the dangers that they pose outward, but the dangers that they pose inward. You know, to have that level of anger and rage constantly, and to fuel that constantly, it's, I mean, in part, I think why our activists die of heart attacks, why our social justice activists and our racial justice activists get sick. I mean, truly, this is how I think about it. I had a friend from graduate school who was very passionate. She was a serious activist, and she had a heart attack at a very young age and passed away within the last couple of weeks. And I truly, I mean, look, in order to fight the fight, you have to engage in self-care. And I think that it's becoming more common, at least in social media circles, for people to be talking about self-care. Like, what are you doing to take care of yourself? Because you cannot stay at an 11 all the time, endlessly, or you'll end up not well. And so thinking about it, especially when you're talking about people who are activists, who are like, no, I am going to bring about the revolution. We are going to bring change. You know, the arc of history bends towards justice, and I'm going to bend it there faster. These are folks who I think need to be reminded that in order to fight the fight, in order to do all these good things, they have to go inward. They have to take care of themselves. And yeah, I think about that a lot. I talk to my students about that a lot because I do worry about them. There is so much passion, and they are ready to mobilize. But I worry about the toll that takes over time.
Yeah, I mean, following up on that, I think humor and levity, right, can be really helpful there, right? Where mixing a judicious amount of fun and joy into anger and rage. And I think that there's a way that I definitely, see what Dan is talking about it, and have seen it in activist communities I've been involved in with as well, as like being burnt out or working yourself way too hard. But I think that even making time for joy, or acknowledging the fact that there is an overlap between rage and joy, right? Like the expression of rage in public can be very cathartic, actually. And I wonder to what extent, having anger and rage, but constraining yourself to, let's say, electoral politics or the kind of basic, not really engaged political life, might also cause some problems. Like, because, just voting or not voting can be really frustrating. You might wait 3 hours in line, and then your person doesn't win anyway, right? And I think that, like, if you can look to like the queer liberation struggle as a good example of this, where there's a considerable amount of humor and levity that's all mixed in with anger and rage. Act Up was hilarious in addition to being terribly angry, right? And so I think that that's kind of like a helpful mix to keep people going. It's at least what I try to do, is laugh as much as I can.
Yeah, that is so great, AJ. And I want to thank you for reminding me of that, because I feel like, I'm the humor scholar, and I forgot about humor for a second. But there is a wonderful viral, there's a wonderful viral video that you may have seen recently, and it was from my neck of the woods out in West Philly. These voters just in line dancing, and the context, the hashtag was like, joy is an act of resistance. And it was so empowering. And I kept kind of chewing on that through the day, that the idea that outward expressions of joy in and of themselves can be acts of resistance. Yeah, so that speaks to the idea of humor and play and levity. Oh, we can't hear you, AJ. You pulled a Dana.
I did it. I did it that time. I'll try to share this in the chat. Oh, I don't know if it'll let me, but let's see if I can. Oh, I can't. All right. Well, I'll share a link to it, but this is a good example of expressions of anger and rage in, let me see if I can get a good link. Yeah, there we go. All right, here we go. Look out for it in the chat. It's coming.
Oh, there it is.
So this is a guy or gal, who knows, who's rioting, right? Which is to me a great expression and catharsis of anger and rage, right? That engaging and is it, property destruction, not that I'm condoning such things, but it is indeed a release, right? It's an expression of anger and rage that, at least if it's just property, it's not harming human beings, etc. But this person is wearing an Elmo head, right? Which creates this amazing, hilarious picture, right? Where you've got Elmo basically inciting riots, etc. Now, again, don't get me wrong, property destruction, etc., not condoning, but this is an expression of joyful rage, right? It's rage, it's anger, and it's hilarious. And so I think that, I don't know, when I see something like this, it gives me life, right? As a meme or whatever, even if I'm not out there, engaging in writing myself, right? It allows me to live vicariously through this notion of like anger and humor simultaneously.
This is wonderful. And I think we're sort of rounding out our discussion. And this was what I was going to ask to finish off anyway, because we had meant to talk a little bit more about the connection between rage and humor, and it's come up along the way. But I think that that's such a vital connection and so important for us to keep in mind, especially in the coming week. I'm sure we all need it. So I was going to ask, what is making you laugh these days? And these are some really nice examples. So a nice way to round out the conversation. So thank you so much. I don't know if there's any other closing thoughts or provocations that you want to finish out with, or maybe we just need to all go and give ourselves an hour of laugh therapy at this point. I know running a sort of semester-long seminar on rage, we're doing so much with it, and really thinking about its productivity, mostly through grassroots, bottom-up social movements. But I'm also at the point now where I'm feeling like, okay, we need to look at actually creativity and expressions of joy and those forms of laughter and art production that also sustain us and give us life. So thank you both for joining us in this really rich conversation, and thank you to our audience for being part of this. This was a very lively chat conversation. It's super distracting to see all the interesting sidebars that have been going on, so hopefully you get a chance to look at that later. So once again, thanks to our organizers and to AJ and to Dana for joining us tonight. Everyone go out and read their books, learn more about how irony and humor and satire and the history of conservative media all go together. And thanks, everybody. Have a good
Thank
night.
you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Amy.
the opportunity to chat and meet you and talk with AJ. This